But as we gather more evidence on how vaccines protect against the more infectious Delta variant, it becomes clearer and clearer that immune responses are waning over time, particularly in older and more vulnerable people. This means that booster doses after the second dose are needed to extend vaccine effectiveness. It's also very clear that vaccines alone are not enough as the temperatures drop in Europe. While the virus is still circulating, other public health measures such as social distancing, face masks, good ventilation and hand washing continue to be key pillars in combating the pandemic. Here in the EMA, we've paused our return to the office. We had a pilot that we were trying to bring people back to work in our office, but we're maintaining the public health measures, including mask wearing and social distancing in all our public spaces. So it's still a difficult time for all of us, and the pandemic is clearly not over, and many of you will have legitimate questions and concerns. But I have to also, on a more positive note, say it's also a time for hope, because we're in a better position today than we were this time last year, with tools such as vaccines and additional medicines now becoming available to help fight the pandemic. And they are truly making a difference, as you will hear later. The high number of people in clinical trials and the unprecedented collaboration among stakeholders were some of the reasons that these vaccines could be approved in record time. But we've also seen a huge increase in manufacturing capacity. Within less than a year, more than 800 million vaccines have been distributed across the EU, and we've also exported 1.1 billion doses to help the rest of the world. EMA experts have carefully reviewed new sites, new formulations, as well as data to support the extension of shelf lives of vaccines to help make this all happen. And the high volumes of vaccine rollout, make this the largest vaccine campaign in history, which also means that we have lots of evidence on which to review and examine even very rare side effects. Vaccines remain a key instrument against COVID-19. This means it's of the utmost importance that people get vaccinated and get their full initial course of vaccine, as well as any booster doses as soon as they are recommended to do so. Nearly 77% of the EU population over 18 is now fully vaccinated, but there are still very important differences in vaccination uptake between countries, and governments in these countries are working hard to address this challenge. If we want to beat the pandemic, it's vital that we all work together and increase vaccination uptake across all countries in the EU. As I mentioned, in addition to vaccines, new therapies are starting to become available, and these will complement, although not replace, vaccines. So this meeting, we want to listen to you. We want to listen to your questions, your concerns, and to respond, to hear what challenges you see, what we can do better. We'll also share with you what EMA and EU health bodies are doing to ensure that vaccines and treatments meeting the high EU standards continue to get approved quickly and after a thorough evaluation, and how once we have approved the medicines and vaccines, we continue to take every effort to ensure that they remain safe and effective. We also welcome here today another important actor in this pandemic, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, ECDC. Although the individual member states are the ones who design and implement the actual vaccination programs and are responsible for the day-to-day measures that help to control the infection, ECDC is monitoring, collaborating and analysing the outcomes, and ECDC will summarise where we are in terms of vaccinating citizens in the EU and will tell us about what impact this is having at a community level. So without any further delay, I'd like to give the floor to Fergus Sweeney, who's our Head of Clinical Studies and Manufacturing, and he's going to be moderating the event today. So over to you, Fergus.
Thank you very much, Emer. And It's also my pleasure to welcome all of you, to extend a warm welcome to this important meeting. And as Emer has said, I will be your moderator today. My name is Fergus Sweeney. I'm head of the Clinical Studies and Manufacturing Task Force here at the European Medicines Agency. Now, as our Executive Director, Emer Cook, has explained, this meeting will provide an update on key aspects of the assessment, approval, safety monitoring, and very importantly, the great impact that the 4 vaccines, Comirnaty, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Janssen, which are so far approved in the EU, have on this disease and its spread. So really important information we'll hear. We'll provide an update about some of the candidate vaccines still under review, and also on new treatments, which you'll be hearing a lot about in the media, and explain how those can work and where we are in the authorization process. Importantly, we've also heard a lot about boosters and third doses, and we'll be discussing these in the context of which they've been reviewed and recommended by the European Medicines Agency. And together with this, we'll look at other developments in the vaccination campaign, such as the use of vaccines in children and in pregnancy. Now, as many of you will be aware, there's a lot of misinformation circulating on social media, on the internet, and it's important for us to be able to guide you to show the information sources that we make available on COVID-19 treatments, vaccines, and therapeutics, and how we're working to ensure that citizens do have a reliable, transparent source of information which is readily understandable and you can use to support your decisions. Our aim is to present the information in a public-friendly manner, so it can be understood by as wide a range of people, of citizens as possible, either online now with us or viewing this in the future. So we'll have 4 presentations to start. We'll run it similarly to our meeting in March. The first presentation is an update on approved and candidate COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics in the European Union. And this will be given by Marco Cavalieri, our head of biological health threats and vaccine strategy at EMA. He will be followed by Georgi Genov, head of pharmacovigilance at EMA, who will present on vaccine safety monitoring and with an update on emerging data since the EU authorizations. We will then have Piotr Kramarz, who's Deputy Head of Unit and Deputy Chief Scientist of the European Centre for Disease Control. As Emer said, they're joining us in this meeting, and he will present on COVID-19 surveillance and vaccination coverage in the EU. So really important information. And finally, to guide you to the sources of reliable information from the European Medicines Agency, we will hear from Melanie Carr, our Head of Stakeholders and Communication Division at EMA. The second part of the meeting is then really for you, all of our listeners. So you've joined us online or in the virtual meeting room, and then you'll have opportunities to present questions so we can hear you, respond to the questions and views that you present. We have people for general public, patients, citizens, healthcare professionals, academics, some people from the pharmaceutical industry. That's your opportunity, all of you European citizens, to pose your questions and express your concerns, and hopefully we can respond to those, and hopefully the presentations which will now start will also help to advise you. In the break, we'll provide you with a Slido link to submit questions. But without further delay, I'd like to hand over to Marco Cavalieri for our first presentation. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fergus, and good afternoon to all of you. So as said, I will give you a bit of an update of where we stand with the activities of the EMA on vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19. Next slide. This is an outline of what I will be speaking to you about. Next one. So this slide is a kind of busy one, but also shows how busy we have been throughout this pandemic so far, and we will continue to be busy. So you will see that right from the declaration of the pandemic, beginning of next year, we immediately took action, established our expert task force, and start talking to developers of new or repurposed therapeutics and also of developers of vaccines. And we started evaluation procedures already in May last year, which led to the first approval of the first therapeutic for COVID-19, which was Veklury in July last year. Then towards the end of last year and beginning of the new one, the vaccines came, and you see that 4 have been approved to start with. And then after the spring this year, we started doing a lot of activities with respect to approving variation of the vaccines initially approved in order to enlarge their use and the recommendation for use in pediatric population to start with. And then importantly, in October around the booster use. And also we have been approving additional therapeutics now, Requiron and Ronapreve, and I will tell you more in a few minutes. But this is just to show the intense work that has gone through in these months and that we will continue carrying on towards the end of this pandemic. Next slide. Let's start with the vaccines. And the first important statement is what is written here on these slides. So vaccines have reduced the impact of the virus, and they do remain a key tool to combat the pandemic. As you know, the Delta variant is spreading around. However, the vaccines are remaining effective, saving thousands, or I would say hundreds of thousands, from hospitalization and death. However, there is still more to do. As you know, cases of infections are rising throughout Europe, and also hospitalizations are growing as a consequence of that. However, it's important for me to underline that most hospitalization and deaths are seen in people that are not vaccinated. Even if still we are seeing that also some vaccinated people, they can get hospitalized with COVID. And this is because there are no vaccines that are 100% effective. And when you vaccinate millions of people and the virus is spreading around quite substantially, you may end up with few cases in which severe disease might occur. But still, they are a tiny proportion of the entirety of people that have been vaccinated. We are also been seeing that protection tends to wane over time, and this is not unexpected. For many vaccines, we've seen the protection decreases after the primary vaccination. And so we may need to restore that protection by using booster doses. Next slide. Indeed, we have already seen emerging data that show how booster doses are able to restore protection against infection of disease, and they confer really high level of antibodies, much higher than what we see after completion of the primary vaccination. As you know, most EU member states are already giving boosters, and the boosters for Comirnaty and Spikevax, which are the messenger RNA vaccine for Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, respectively, have been approved by the EMA with a 6 months interval after the completion of the second dose, so the primary series in adults. And this opinion came up in a timely way at the beginning of October, leaving flexibility on the use of the booster doses depending on the epidemiological situation in the countries, acknowledging that things will be moving very dynamically throughout this cold season and with respect to decisions taken by public health authorities. Also, we are evaluating a booster dose for the Janssen COVID-19 vaccine that should be given from 2 months after the first dose in adults. As you know, the Janssen COVID-19 vaccine requires a single dose for completing the primary vaccination series. We have also been approving extra doses of Comirnaty and Spikevax for people with severely weakened immune systems aged 12 years and older, because we saw that indeed in this group of people that are not responding well to vaccination, a third dose is very important in order to increase the immune response. And I'm also glad to anticipate to you that today the CHMP gave a positive opinion for the use of Comirnaty in children from 5 years of age, including children that have severely weakened immune system, similarly to what we already decided here for those 12 years and older. Next slide. What about the safety of the booster doses, which is a question that has been emerging quite substantially? First of all, let me say that this is the largest vaccination campaign ever, and the safety profile that we've seen so far is very reassuring. The current data will show that the common side effects after the booster are very similar to what we've seen after the second dose of either Comirnaty or Spikevax. And now there is a growing number of people that are receiving the booster dose, and so far we are not seeing any specific safety concern emerging, which is extremely reassuring. Of course, the risk of myocarditis and pericarditis or other very rare side effects after boosting are carefully monitored, and you will hear more about what we're doing in terms of safety monitoring for vaccines for COVID-19. Next slide. Another important area of discussion has been the possibility of mix and matching different vaccines, what is called heterologous vaccination. And you see here in this slide that this heterologous vaccination could occur in the context of the primary series for vaccination, in which you give a certain type of vaccine as first dose and another type as a second one. But it can also happen in the context of heterologous boosting. In this case, maybe a single type of vaccine has been given for the primary vaccination series with 2 doses, and then a booster with a different type of vaccine is administered. And so far, what we've seen that there is a very good immune response with certain type of heterologous primary vaccination or heterologous booster vaccination schemes, which is extremely reassuring and extremely important because it will increase the flexibility in the member states on which vaccine to use in the context of primary vaccination or boosting. And EMA will be providing some recommendation based on the current evidence of what could be the best strategies to be used in the context of heterologous primary vaccination or heterologous boosting. And we are still aiming to come up with this recommendation by the end of next week or soon thereafter. Next slide. As said, a very important topic is what about the use of COVID-19 vaccines in children? And we know that severe COVID-19 and death remain quite rare among children. However, disease of all severity still occur in all the pediatric ages. Moreover, high transmission results in increased hospitalization in children of all ages, and we are seeing this according to the most recent epidemiological data from Europe and other parts of the world. Although children with underlying conditions would be more vulnerable to the consequences of the infection with this virus, healthy children do also represent the majority of pediatric hospitalization in the European Union based on the data collected from the ECDC. After COVID-19, moreover, children can suffer from what is called the multisystem inflammatory syndrome, which is quite a nasty disease and can be very severe with admission to intensive care in up to 70% of the cases. So another quite detrimental effect of infection with COVID-19 in pediatric ages. The children also can be exposed to the long-term consequences of COVID-19, which is currently poorly understood and will go into the generic name of long COVID or post-acute COVID. But we have the impression that we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and we need to learn more about what this means and what really is the burden of disease associated with the long-term consequences of infection with this virus in the pediatric population. Next slide. So, from an EMA perspective, as said before, the 2 messenger RNA vaccine, Comirnaty and Spikevax, have been approved for the use in children from 12 years of age. And also, as said, I'm glad to tell you that Comirnaty from today has received approval for children 5 to 11 years of age. And this is based on a different dose than the one used in adults, essentially is a much lower dose. Spikevax is under review for a very similar age group, so from 6 to 11 years old. Member states are then able to decide on how to use this vaccine in children as part of their vaccination campaign. But EMA is always working together with the ECDC, trying to give all the support that we can to national authorities in helping them with making their decisions. Next slide. Another important area is what the impact of COVID-19 in pregnancy and how much vaccines could help here as well. COVID-19 indeed can be particularly dangerous for pregnant women, and vaccination offers them protection. We have seen already data that clearly show that the messenger RNA vaccine are able to prevent COVID-19 in this vulnerable group. And also studies on safety of the messenger RNA vaccine in pregnancy are at the moment not suggesting any safety concern. Considering that now we are seeing pregnant women going to hospital because of COVID and also to the intensive care, it's very important that we consider vaccination in this vulnerable group in order to save the life of the mothers and the children. Next slide. So, as you know, our process requires that we continue maintaining our standard with respect to quality, safety, and efficacy of the medicinal products and the vaccine, but at the same time trying to speed up as much as we can in order that effective vaccines and therapeutics can reach patients in need and the general population as soon as possible. And in the context of the conditional marketing authorization that was granted for all the COVID-19 vaccine up to date, we have been recently renewing for another year this authorization for 3 of them, Spikevax, Comirnaty, and Vaxzevria. And at the same time, we are trying to look into a way of accelerating the process to come up with a full marketing authorization as soon as we can. And so there will be more to follow in this area as well. Next slide. You can see here on our website all the information with respect to what DMA is doing with respect to COVID-19 vaccine, which one have been authorized, which one are under evaluation or rolling review, and where we stand overall with the appraisal of vaccines for COVID. Next slide. With respect to vaccines that are in more advanced evaluation stage, Nuvaxovid, which is the vaccines from Novavax, which is the first protein-based vaccine, is undergoing an evaluation for marketing authorization. This is based essentially on the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is a key protein on the surface of the virus that acts a bit as the key in order for the virus to enter into the cells in our body. It also contains an adjuvant that helps strengthen the immune response to the vaccine. The start of the final assessment after rolling review has been completed, and now we are entering to the final phase of the evaluation. And we do really hope to conclude on this vaccine as soon as we can. Next slide. There are other vaccines that are still undergoing rolling review by EMA, and the 3 of them, you see them on this slide. The first one is the one called Sputnik 5. We started rolling review in March. It's based on 2 different adenoviruses as viral vector, so in a kind of heterologous vaccination, and is developed by the Gamaleya National Center of Epidemiology and Microbiology. Then we got another vaccine, which is called the CoronaVac. This vaccine is based on another platform technology. Essentially, is a whole virus that has been inactivated, so killed and used in order to generate an immune response that will be protective. And this is developed by Sinovac Life Science. And the third one that is under rolling review is called Vitpreftin. This is based on a more traditional technology similarly to the Novavax one. So it's the spike protein with an adjuvanting system. And this is developed by Sanofi Pasteur. Next slide. Now, moving away from vaccines and entering into the area of therapeutics, it's important for me to start by saying that therapeutics could be extremely important in order to complement but not replace the role the vaccines have in the fight against COVID-19. New or repurposed therapeutic could treat or prevent COVID-19, and we've seen quite a large evidence on a number of investigational agents in this regard. They are therefore expected to provide an additional tool to reduce the burden of disease associated with COVID-19. And we could argue that therapeutics would be particularly relevant for vulnerable groups, and people who do not respond adequately for vaccination. Next slide. So what kind of products are we talking about? Essentially, we have two big areas of type of medicine. The first one are so-called biological medicine and include neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, which are made of proteins that are able to attach to the virus and stopping it from entering into the cells in our body and therefore preventing the spread of the virus and the severe symptoms that will occur once the virus is spreading. Others, on the contrary, will work as immunomodulatory agents, so with a very different mechanism of action, and they are aimed to reduce the activity of the body's immune system with the aim of reducing inflammation and ultimately respiratory failure and death. Some other agents are chemical medicine. They can be small antiviral molecules that can be given orally, which is a big advantage. And they can act on different targets within the virus, either the polymerase, which is the machinery for creating new viral particles, or certain specific proteins like the protease, which are necessary for assembling viruses that can then proliferate into the body. Other chemical agents work as immunomodulatory agents, so similarly to some of the biologics, and they would help to stabilize the abnormal immune responses that we see once the disease is progressing and patient gets severe COVID. Next slide. And you can find here on our website all information as well on therapeutic, as I just mentioned, but also even more. Next slide. So far we got 3 therapeutics agents authorized in the European Union. As mentioned before, Veklury, that is based on remdesivir, has been the first one to be approved for the treatment of COVID in people from 12 years of age with pneumonia requiring extra oxygen. And as said, recently we approved these 2 monoclonal antibodies products. The first one is based on the monoclonal called remdesivir, which is approved for the treatment of COVID-19 in adults at increased risk of severe disease. So before really they get a COVID that requires hospitalization. And a similar indication has been granted for Ronapreve, which is based on a cocktail of 2 monoclonal antibodies, casirivimab and imdevimab. And also this cocktail has been approved for the prevention of COVID-19 in people from 12 years of age on top of the treatment of disease indication similarly to remdesivir. Next slide. But there are many more that we are evaluating. And you see here on this slide the 3 specific immunomodulatory agents that we are evaluating for marketing authorization. The first one is based on baricitinib, which is a repurposed agent. All of them actually, they are repurposed agents. And this one is for the treatment of COVID-19 in hospitalized patients from 10 years of age who require extra oxygen. Similar indications are also going to be looked at for anakinra, which is another immunomodulatory agent, and tocilizumab as well, which has been quite widely discussed since the start of the pandemic as a potential option for treatment of severe COVID. And we do really hope that at least for some of these agents, we will be able to come up with an approval before the end of this year. Next slide. Then there are 2 products that have already started the actual marketing authorization as new therapeutics, so not repurposed agents. One is sotrovimab, which is another monoclonal antibodies for a similar indication as the other one that I mentioned just earlier. And then the second one is molnupiravir, Lagevrio, which is one of these small molecule antivirals that can be given by oral route and therefore are quite attractive considering that they are supposed to be used essentially in the community. Next slide. And also under rolling review, there is another agent, which is another cocktail of monoclonal antibody composed of dixagevimab and silgavimab under the name of Evusheld. And this one, really, the development has been initially focused on the prevention of COVID-19 in adults, although there are also studies emerging with respect to the treatment, similarly to what we're seeing with the other monoclonals. So the pipeline of antiviral agents is quite lively and quite robust, and we do really hope that in the near future we will be able to conclude at least with some of them. Next slide. Specifically, with respect to the oral antivirals Lagevrio, so based on molnupiravir, but also an additional one that is called the Paxlovid, which is developed by Pfizer for a similar indication as molnupiravir. We have been looking into the preliminary evidence that has become available, at least with respect to molnupiravir. We were able to give an advice to member states with respect to the potential use in the context of emergency use for this antiviral agent, and we will do the same also for Paxlovid should the evidence that we have be sufficient to do so. We think that this is very important since we don't have an emergency use authorization at European level, and this can be used as a kind of surrogate in order to support member states' decision with respect to the emergency use of these antiviral drugs. Next slide. So this is my conclusive slide. And first of all, let me reiterate that vaccines protect against the heavy burden of disease and death related to COVID-19 and remain the crucial tool in the fight against this pandemic. Infections, as you know, are growing in Europe as a result of the spread of the Delta variant, the cold season, the waning immunity after the primary vaccination, and relaxation of social measures in many places. Vaccination coverage in some places is unfortunately still very low, leaving many unvaccinated people vulnerable to severe disease. Now it's time to fill this vaccination gap, and we should do this as soon as we can as a top priority. Booster doses in parallel are also very important since they are able to restore the protection of people who already had the primary cycle and bring back the same level of protection from infection and disease. Besides vaccines, safe and effective therapeutics will be extremely helpful in the fight against COVID-19, but they do not replace vaccination. So they should be seen as a complementary tool, very important because unfortunately many more people will get sick with this virus. European citizens are encouraged to get vaccinated and follow public health measures recommended by the authorities in order to keep themselves safe and the infection levels low. We are pretty confident that with all these tools and all with these measures, we will be able to cut down the burden of disease associated with this virus and end this pandemic in the near future. I will stop here and I will hand over to my colleague, Georg Benov, who will talk about what we're doing around safety monitoring. Over to you, Georg.
Thank you very much, Marco. Good afternoon, all. I'm Georgi Genov, and I'm the head of pharmacovigilance at the European Medicines Agency. If we move on to the outline of my presentation, I firstly would like to highlight that COVID-19 vaccination campaign is the largest ever, and based on the wealth of information that we have received and evaluated, the safety profile of COVID-19 vaccines remains very reassuring. In the next 15 minutes, I will provide a high-level overview of safety monitoring of COVID-19 vaccines. Moving on to the next slide, let me start with a brief reminder as to why do we need to monitor safety after approval. All medicines, including vaccines, have benefits and risks. As with any mass vaccination campaign, issues might arise that have not been identified in clinical trials. As regulators, we need to detect those, act swiftly, and communicate in full transparency. To manage these exceptional circumstances, additional resources are being mobilized to closely monitor safety. Moving on to the next slide. Here, one of the main pillars of safety monitoring is review of suspected side effects reported by patients and healthcare professionals. Anybody can report, and all reports are sent to Eurovigilance, our European database of suspected side effects. I would like to use this opportunity to express our gratitude to all that took the time to submit to Eurovigilance this important information to allow us to closely monitor the safety of COVID-19 vaccines. On the next slide, you could see the impressive size of the vaccination campaign, both in terms of doses administered, that you can see in the green bubbles, but also the wealth of information we have received. It is essential to understand that reports from patients and healthcare professionals describe medical events that have occurred following vaccination, which doesn't necessarily mean that they've been caused by the vaccine. Those could very well be caused by other health conditions that have occurred in temporal association to the use of the vaccine. It is also important to put the numbers of suspected side effects in the context of how many people have been vaccinated and for how long. Moving on to the next slide. Let's take the key question: do COVID-19 vaccine remain safe? The safety of vaccine is continuously monitored. COVID-19 vaccines with over 589 million doses administered continue to show a very reassuring safety profile. As with all medicines, side effects do occur, but these are usually mild, are outweighed by far by the benefits that vaccines bring against severe disease and death. Let's move on to the next slide. Let's focus our attention on a few examples of risks detected and managed post-approval. Our pharmacovigilance system has been particularly efficient in detecting and managing new safety issues. EU was at the forefront of dealing with the very rare side effects of unusual blood clots with low blood platelets, the so-called thrombosis and thrombocytopenia syndrome, or TTS. We have detected earlier the risk and managed the risk for Vaxzevria, and we have been proactive in dealing with the risk for Janssen and acted even before the vaccine was rolled out in the EU. It is important to note that TTS cases remain very rare, and at the bottom of this slide, I draw your attention to symptoms to be aware of post-vaccination to detect early this very rare condition. Let's move on to another example of safety issue on the next slide, detected and managed. This relates to myocarditis post-vaccination with mRNA vaccines, which occurs in very rare cases, and it is observed primarily in the 14 days after vaccination, more often after the second dose and more often in younger male. It's important to know that the course of this condition is generally mild and responds very well to treatment. When discussing risks, it is important to put those in the context of benefits that vaccination provides in terms of preventing hospitalization and death. For this particular condition, we should also note that COVID-19 itself can cause myocarditis. And if we consider for children and adolescents the risk that COVID causes that Marco described earlier, the so-called Multisystem Inflammatory syndrome, we should know that this condition can also cause myocarditis as a result of COVID, among other serious complications. Let's move on to the next slide. We as regulators are committed to continuously monitor the benefits and risk of vaccines. And so how do we look at reports? A scientific assessment looks at the suspected side effects in the context of the person's individual case to determine if it may be caused by the vaccine or it might have occurred for other reasons. Side effects assessed in the context of all available data on the vaccines, and this could include clinical trials, other studies, and the scientific literature. We draw science-based conclusions on the benefits and the risk and could take a number of different actions if these are warranted. Let's move on to the next slide. Unfortunately, we have seen a lot of misinformation circulating online, including posts in social media misappropriating our logo and providing inaccurate information. So it is very important to get the facts right and refer to reliable sources of information, such as the websites of medicine regulators. So on our website, we have medicine overview addressing questions and answers in lay language. We publish the risk management plans, which describe how safety data is collected and how risk can be mitigated. And we have recommendations and precautions for the safe and effective use of each approved vaccine. For healthcare professionals, this can be found in the summary of product characteristics, and for patients in the package leaflet. Furthermore, if we move to the next slide, We publish on a monthly basis safety updates, which contain the main outcomes from the PRAC latest safety assessment and inform of what new information will be added to the product information, as well as updates on assessments of new safety data, overall information on how safety is monitored, and some background information on the vaccines. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, in addition to reports we review on a very intensive basis in reports submitted in vigilance, as well as studies requested to the vaccine manufacturers and careful review of all published scientific literature, we have commissioned independent EMA studies which allow us to quickly generate background rates and support prompt evaluation of any arising new safety concerns. So moving to the next slide. In the context of COVID-19, we have seen and we have benefited from a very intense collaboration with other regulators. We have used established frameworks and have set up new ones in order to exchange promptly information, to get access to worldwide data, and also to use assessments from other regulators and expertise. Let's move on to the next slide. In conclusion, let me highlight the main points. COVID-19 is the largest vaccine campaign ever, and the safety profile of the vaccines remains very reassuring. A strong EU pharmacovigilance system is in place. Safety is our priority and will not be compromised. Unprecedented efforts have been made to manage high volume of safety information. Very rare side effects, some serious, have been detected quickly, assessed promptly, and acted upon. And this has been supported by continuous transparency and communication to the public. We have enhanced tools for safety monitoring and frameworks for risk communication and quite intensive international collaboration. COVID-19 vaccine safety is stronger with your participation. Please continue to report suspected side effects. That ends my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. With that, I will pass to the next speaker.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Piotr. Thank you.
My name is Piotr Kramars. I'm the Deputy Chief Scientist at the ECDC in Stockholm. We work very closely with our colleagues at the European Medicines Agency, and it's my pleasure to present at this very important meeting. Next slide, please. I will tell you a little about ECDC role, and then I will show you some update on the global and EU epidemiological situation. And then finally, I will show you some information about the current status of the vaccine uptake, about the genomic variants, and about the importance of so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions. A lot of what I'll be presenting comes from ECDC work as part of the public health emergency. We raised the level of alert to the highest second level at the beginning of last year already, and we've remained at that level since then. Next slide, please. ECDC is an EU agency like the European Medicines Agency, and we are responsible for coordinating prevention and control of communicable diseases in the EU. And as part of this, we conduct epidemiological surveillance at the EU level. And for COVID, it means monitoring of case, death, testing rates, test positivity, which is like a proportion of all the tests that come out positive for COVID, and more. We also provide support to public health microbiology work of the member states. And as part of this, we issue guidance on rapid antigen test use or genetic sequencing. Based on all the information that we collect and expert considerations, we issue scientific advice about the optimal ways to combat COVID. And in that, we provide options for the member states to prevent and to fight COVID. And the member states choose the right options depending on their situation. We also provide direct support to member states when needed and when requested. And for example, now we are working especially closely with countries with a low vaccination coverage to help them change this situation. And finally, we provide preparedness support, capacity building, and health communication support. On the picture, you see our emergency operations center. I myself am part of a roster of so-called emergency managers, and I work there from time to time on shifts as an emergency manager. Next slide, please. Let's start with a look at the global situation. This graph shows you the evolution of the numbers of cases over time globally, and you can see that the story is not over. We are going through another wave of COVID, and it's very much driven by what is happening in Europe, the dark blue bars on the graph. But compared to the previous waves, we have more effective tools, and especially we have vaccination, and we have to use it to the maximum potential. Next slide, please. Let's focus now on the situation in Europe. On this picture, you can see two graphs. The blue curve shows the behavior of the case rate, and you see the rapid increase in the recent weeks. And the green curve shows you the slow increase in the death rates. And this discrepancy between the rapid increase of the cases and slow increase in deaths is largely contributable to the use of vaccines. Vaccines do prevent transmission, as you heard, and an infection, but not at 100%. But they are very good at preventing death and severe COVID. And you can see it on this graph. Next slide, please. But the use of the vaccines is just one of the important factors that are driving the situation at the moment. And looking at the vaccination uptake, as of today, around 66% of the total population is vaccinated fully, and around 77% of the adult population, which means that more than 20% of the adult population for whom vaccines are available and recommended are not vaccinated. Secondly, what is driving the recent developments to a large extent is the spread of the Delta variant. The Delta variant, you will see on my next slides, is dominating in Europe now, and it's up to 60% more transmissible than Alpha, the previously predominant variant, and Alpha was already more transmissible than the original Wuhan variant. Finally, what we observed during the summer and shortly after was a widespread relaxation of so-called non-pharmaceutical measures. And these include things like physical distancing, face mask wearing, various hygienic measures. And this is also contributing to what we see now, all the increases and worsening of the situation. Next slide, please. So let's first look at the impact of vaccination. On this curve, you can see the evolution of death rates over time since the beginning of this year until now. And this is displayed by the different levels of vaccine uptake in different countries. And you can compare the steeply increasing curve on the top, the orange one. These are death rates in countries with the lowest vaccination uptake. And then you can compare it to the bottom of the graph, where you see what is happening in countries with the highest vaccine uptake. And you can see the difference. This is because vaccines prevent deaths, and you will see that they also prevent severe COVID on the next slide. So here you can see a similar situation when we look at the hospital occupancy over time. Again, the hospital occupancy increases or doesn't increase. The curves are quite flat when the vaccine uptake is the highest. Next slide, please. Here you can see similar picture when you look at the intensive care unit occupancy over time. And this is very important. As I said several times, the vaccines are very good at preventing severe COVID, hospitalizations, intensive care admissions, deaths. It's important because this saves lives and protects health, but it's also very important to protect the healthcare systems and the healthcare workers who are under a lot of pressure, and this pressure has been increasing in the recent weeks. Next slide, please. no single parameter can reflect the situation, the pandemic situation at this stage of the pandemic. And at the CDC, we use now a composite indicator which combines case notification rates, test positivity, situation among the elderly, situation in the hospitals, and death rates into one indicator. And the darkness of the color corresponds to the level of concern in the situation. When you move from the west to the east of Europe, roughly, you can see that the situation worsens and the level of concern increases. You can see the evolution of this indicator at weekly intervals. We update these graphs on Thursdays. Next slide, please. And you can compare it now to the vaccine uptake. You can see now the level of vaccine uptake in Europe. Again, moving from west to east, roughly, you can see the vaccine uptake gets lower. And it doesn't take much time to see the correlation. The higher the vaccine uptake, the lower the level of concern with the current pandemic situation. Next slide, please. You probably noticed on my previous slide that I showed you the status as of November 14, but it doesn't change very much. You can see here on this graph the behavior of the vaccine uptake over time in different age groups. And you can see that after a slow start at the beginning of the year, when there were a few, then there was a period of quite rapid increase. But in the recent weeks, there has been a plateauing of all the curves, almost all of them, and it's very difficult to move even by 1%, and this is very worrying. Next slide, please. Another important factor that is driving the recent developments is the spread of the Delta variant. Monitoring of genomic variants of the virus is extremely important. This virus mutates as all coronaviruses do. It changes and new variants emerge. And it's very important to detect early any new variants with changed transmissibility or severity of disease or effectiveness of vaccines or medicines. The capacity for such monitoring varies quite a lot across the EU, but it's increasing. And we at ECDC work very closely, on the one hand, with the European Commission, and on the other hand, with the member states to improve the infrastructure and to train personnel so that this capacity for genomic monitoring increases. And it will be used not only for COVID, but hopefully in the future for other pathogens. Based on all this monitoring, we can see that the Delta variant is now dominating Europe. It evolves further, and there are some sublineages which we closely monitor. One of them you probably heard about is the AY 4.2. It has slightly increased transmissibility. It doesn't seem to cause more severe disease or escape immunity. But it's extremely important to reduce the viral transmission at the moment and the viral spread, because the more of this spread, the higher the chance that a new variant with some dangerous properties will emerge. Next slide. And you can do this on the one hand through vaccination, but on the other hand through so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as physical distancing, mask wearing where indicated, hand hygiene, etc. We have increasing evidence that they work. They work not only for COVID, for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but for other respiratory viruses like the influenza virus. But their effectiveness depends on how early and how swiftly they are implemented. And when they are implemented, they have to be accompanied by clear risk communication to explain to the population why they are introduced, based on what parameters, and when they will be lifted. Community engagement is key here. ECDC, together with the Joint Research Center, maintains a database of measures of these non-pharmaceutical interventions implemented by the member states. And when we looked at this database, we noticed that at the beginning of November, overall fewer measures were in place when compared to the situation a year ago at the same time or 6 months ago. And also this is driving the current developments. Next slide. So I would like to leave you with 3 key messages. The first one is that the highest priority is the continued effort to increase vaccination coverage, to vaccinate those for whom vaccination is recommended and who are not vaccinated. We have to close the gaps in vaccination everywhere. Secondly, EU and EEA countries should consider a booster dose for adult population, especially those 40 years of age and over, targeting first, of course, the most vulnerable and the elderly. And finally, even in countries with high vaccine uptake, maintaining or reintroducing the non-pharmaceutical measures remains vital to reduce transmission. We are approaching now the end of year festive season when people will be traveling, they will be shopping, they will be meeting with their families, their friends. And applying these measures will help control the spread of the virus, and we will protect the health and the lives and the healthcare systems functioning. Next slide, please. We've observed during this pandemic an unprecedented spread of misinformation and disinformation. In fact, the next presentation will be about this. And the best way to address it is to spread facts, factual information and evidence-based information. And I would like to encourage you to visit these links and help us review the information there and help us spread this through your networks, starting with the rapid risk assessment that we just published yesterday on our website. And I presented you some elements that come from this rapid risk assessment, but you have much more there. So please start with this first link. Next slide, please. Finally, I would like to acknowledge all the member state experts with whom we work, who submit the data that we analyze and that I presented to you. And they also help us with our scientific advice development, and all the ECDC colleagues with whom I have a pleasure to work. Thank you very much. And now to introduce Melanie Carr, who will talk about addressing the misinformation about COVID. Melanie, please go ahead.
Thank you, Piotr, and good afternoon to everyone. So in my presentation, I would like to highlight the importance of reaching out to reputable sources for information, echoing the comments of many of the previous speakers. On to the next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on aspects of misinformation, talk about how we at the EMA are working to address it through communication and transparency and engagement with stakeholders. On to the next one, please. Now, just by way of background, and perhaps somewhat surprisingly, given the magnitude and the gravity of the pandemic, we are seeing a high level of misinformation and disinformation circulating, which has a large public health impact. It undermines trust in medicines, fuels vaccine hesitancy, and limits uptake of life-saving vaccines. In particular, social media is being used to propagate an infodemic where disinformation and misinformation are being spread. It's also supporting, in some sense, the polarization of public debate on topics related to COVID-19. It's therefore critical that we work hard to stem the tide of misinformation and address confusing or misleading information head-on. On to the next one, please. So a few words about what we're doing at EMA. We're working to identify particular concerns and misinformation as early as possible, looking at the sorts of issues being raised in queries we receive from members of the public. We're not doing this alone, we're working closely with our regulatory partners, notably our colleagues at the European Commission and WHO. We're also engaging in active dialogue with the public and our stakeholders to listen to your concerns. Our aim is to address proactively and, if you like, pre-bunk the myths, trying to address the concerns before they take hold. We're also working hard to set the record straight as far as we can and have our voices heard on social media and through other communication channels. And our aim is to communicate the fact-based science that supports our regulatory decisions and, of course, to ensure full transparency on EMA's actions and decisions and also on any data supporting our regulatory decisions. On to the next one, please. I'd like to give a couple of examples of misinformation that have come up recently. This first one relates to reports of suspected side effects reported in our safety database, which is called EUDRA-Vigilance. And these were picked up on social media. There were false reports showing inflated numbers of side effects reported with the vaccines that were wrongly claiming to be sourced from EMA. So to address this now, the agency provides a summary of the overall number of side effect reports and also publishes monthly safety updates that we produce for each of the vaccines. These reports put the number of suspected side effects into the context of the doses given and also provide the latest information on the safety profile in those monthly reports. And on the right-hand side, you'll see an image from our website where you can go and find access to the real numbers and also for further explanation. On to the next one, please. And another example. This one relates to claims that there is insufficient data on the quality, safety and effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines, primarily due to the speed at which they've been developed and brought to the market. Now, to address this, EMA has published information explaining how vaccines are developed and authorised and how this can be condensed without compromising standards. And again, we've produced some infographics which are shown here on the right-hand side of the slide. And this really is supported by some material which explains how vaccines are developed comparing to more standard cycles and how that is brought much shorter to the market. Once again, we want to emphasize that there are extensive study results to support the vaccines, and we have full transparency on the basis of the authorizations. This is detailed in the assessments. So we publish European public assessment reports, and also we publish the clinical data that underpins those assessments. On then to a few words about how we're communicating. On to the next one. So yes, indeed, we are communicating. We've developed a number of new information materials, or several tiers of information on development and approval of vaccines. We're also responding to queries from members of the public, as well as patients, healthcare professionals, academia and media. We're updating on key developments with regular bi-weekly press briefings, organising public meetings such as this one, and also engaging on social media. We're also undertaking more and more interviews with the media. Working with ECDC to provide content for the European Vaccination Information Portal. And importantly, on the portal, you'll find information on vaccines in all EU languages. And as and when needed, we will be providing safety communications to complement regular monthly safety updates. Now, I'd also like to share some examples on the next slide of the information we're publishing. So this slide shows an image that we've produced for Twitter, which is updated every week. And that really provides a snapshot overview of the vaccines which are under rolling review, evaluation or authorised. And we produce a similar one for therapeutics. On to the next one then. And this again, referring back to how vaccines are developed and authorised, provides the different tiers of information where you can go in and read an explanation about that. It also covers the post-marketing monitoring phase. And again, it clarifies that vaccines are being developed following the same legal requirements for pharmaceutical quality, safety and efficacy as for other medicines. On to the next one, please. Now, in terms of information on vaccines, we provide several levels of information. So you can start by looking at the high-level product information. You can look at medicines overviews, which are written in very simple, plain language. Then you can delve into more detail into the assessment itself in the European Public Assessment Reports. And then if you'd like to go into more detail on the clinical data, you can access the clinical data on this area of our website, which is shown on the slide, and that shows the data that has underpinned those regulatory decisions. It includes the clinical summaries, but also the clinical study reports. On to the next one, please. And this is just another example of the information we're putting out on social media. It shows how we're communicating on the evaluation and the approval of COVID-19 vaccines, primarily on Twitter and LinkedIn, and we have a simple timeline on the right-hand side to visualize the process. On to the next one. And this just summarizes who we're working with. So we're actively engaging with patients, healthcare professionals, through their representatives in the pandemic task force, also very importantly through our regular working party interactions. And they're also assisting us in user testing our information materials, and we're doing more and more of this. Working closely with the European Commission, with ECDC and the national competent authorities. We're also making efforts to communicate information in the most meaningful way, so using plain language and, again, user testing the messages to promote understanding. On to the next one, please. Now, we are very keen to listen to the public and our stakeholders and address any concerns on vaccines as they arise. We launched the first in our series of public stakeholder meetings in December, and today's meeting brings us to a total of 4. Links of the previous meetings are provided here for ease of access. On to the next one, please. And really, this is just to close. So in terms of the take-home messages from me, it really is to be wary of misinformation. It can have serious consequences. So to ensure you get the facts, go to the public health authorities and other reputable sources of information. Ensuring access to reliable information, good and timely communication and transparency are really key to reinforcing trust in decisions of regulators, but also in understanding the rationale that underpins those all-important decisions on medicines and vaccines. And it's not just about transparency, it's about providing access to clinical data. We don't just want to publish information, we also want to add context, explain the science in plain language. Engagement is really crucial for us, so actively listening to your questions, to any concerns you have so we can hopefully address them, and involving stakeholders and members of the public in our activities. And on that note, we're very much looking forward to discussing with you today. So on my final slide, I'll leave you to a link to our corporate website for further information, where you'll find all information on COVID accessible through our COVID homepage. So thank you very much, and I'll now pass the floor back to Fergus. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you very much to all our presenters. They've been really insightful, good information, and excellent timekeeping as well. So thank you. We've got a good overview now of the assessment, the safety, and the epidemiological situation, and how the vaccines are working really importantly to combat COVID-19. We're now going to break for 5 minutes, and then we'll begin our open session when the floor is yours. All of you have the opportunity to answer questions, and we really encourage you to use the Slido. I know some are sending in questions through other channels in social media, but please, I encourage everybody, whatever way you're listening, to use the Slido. We'll display a slide now giving the Slido address link so that you can submit questions, and we'll come back in about 5 minutes, so 2:15 where we are, but we have people in many time zones, so 2:15. See you then. I'm looking forward to a really active discussion. Thank you.